Welcome once again to a futures video. I'd like to start off by showing you a two-space, and in this two-space we have on the vertical axis mean historical profits, pi stands for profits. On the horizontal axis we have standard deviation of historical profits, and what I'm about to show you is futures information, but looking at it from the perspective of portfolio theory. We are considering a portfolio of two assets. One asset is our commodity that we have some position in, and the second is the futures contract that we have a hedging or offsetting position in. So let's start off by identifying the feasible set equivalent. And right here, this dot right here, is where the hedge ratio is 0. In other words, where we'd be unhedged, spot asset only. And then so the hedge ratio again is 0. Here, as we go down here, that dot right there is the minimum variance or minimum standard deviation portfolio, and we're just assuming the hedge ratio there is 0.6. And then continuing down to where the concept of a feasible set comes into play as opposed to efficient set. This dot right here would be where we'd be if we were 100% hedged, and a hedge ratio of 1. So from the red dot to this blue dot, the feasible set equivalent, but from the minimum variance blue dot to the unhedged blue dot, hedging efficiency frontier. Okay, the portfolio equivalent of the efficient set from here to here. And so the minimum variance hedge involves this amount of profit and this amount of risk, standard deviation risk, and but this red indifference curve is meant to show you where a specific or individual risk-averse investor might end up, and there's a tangency between that indifference curve and the hedging efficiency frontier right there. And I just said let's assume that's a hedge ratio of 0.4, and that's where the hedger would choose to be, and this is his profit expectation, this is his risk expectation. We see the minimum variance has a lower expected profit and less risk. He's choosing to take on some risk in the hopes of getting more profit, as evidenced by this one indifference curve from his indifference map. So the investor chooses to be right here with a hedge ratio of 0.4. Again, the point here is hedgers do not necessarily desire the minimum variance hedge ratio. They may assume more risk in an attempt to earn higher profits. In other words, they underhedge. Okay? The volatility of futures prices is often greater than the volatility of cash prices. And so underhedging is often more efficient than overhedging. Okay, so it's a very important little diagram here. It's kind of neat that it brings in portfolio theory to the futures topic area, and so spend a little time with that. Again, the buzz phrase is hedging efficiency frontier. Okay, alrighty. So let's talk about primary causes of poor hedging performance, and there's two of them: basis risk, which we've talked about, and instability of the hedge ratio. Okay? And so let's focus on basis risk for a moment. What do we know about the basis? Basis, question mark. What do we know about the basis? Well, we know the basis will narrow as delivery approaches. This is known as convergence. Okay, that's evidenced when we are hedging with the same commodity futures contract, which is generally ideal. That's as opposed to cross-hedging. A second thing we know about the basis is that there is a negative bound on the basis because of cash and carry quasi-arbitrage activity, which I described in great detail in a prior video. So that gave us a negative bound on the basis. Remember, we kept the future, cash and carry quasi-arbitrage activity keeps the futures price from getting too high because we short the futures contract, And if the futures price can't get too high, then the basis, which is the cash price minus the futures price, can't get too low or too negative. So there's a negative bound on the basis. Okay. Now we also know there is not an upper bound on the basis, because reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrage activity is not guaranteed to be able to take place, because reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrage activity involves taking a short position in the spot asset, and short positions in the spot asset require borrowing of the spot asset, and there are certain times when spot assets cannot be borrowed. One important time to remember is when the economy is really heated up. Industrial metal futures prices are impacted because of the inability of wannabe arbitrageurs to execute reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrages, because they can't borrow the spot asset to short it, because, again, in this little example with industrial metals, industrial metals, they can't be borrowed, and hence if you can't borrow and then short sell the spot asset, you can't execute the reverse cash and carry quasi-arbitrage activity. Okay, so that's another thing we know about the basis. And a fourth thing that we know about the basis is there's a seasonal effect. So there's a seasonal in the basis. If, for example, we're considering a candy firm that makes a lot of chocolate candy, that firm might be interested in hedging the price of cocoa, and so they might use cocoa futures. And so the folks that are involved with the hedging program for cocoa futures for a candy manufacturer would be experts in understanding the behavior of the basis. And so the details of understanding seasonal and basis is is left to those that are experts in specific commodities. Okay? So now what's interesting here is that when we're hedging with futures contracts, we're doing so because we want to reduce or control price risk. And so the important thing to realize is when we use futures contracts to hedge price risk, we're expecting a benefit. But we also know that because there's variability in the basis, we have this basis risk that sometimes the basis can move against us, okay? Sometimes, especially when there's a seasonal in the basis, sometimes the basis, which is just the cash price moving relative to the futures price moving. So, because the basis is just cash price minus futures price, so sometimes the basis can move to our detriment, and so there's the idea of basis hedging comes in. And the objective of basis hedging would be to supplement the basic hedge ratio analysis with timing decisions based upon predictable basis changes. And this is getting at this concept of a seasonal. Now, it's predictable, but not perfectly predictable. Okay? And if your predictions end up being accurate, your hedging will result in greater profits and or greater risk reduction. Okay? But to obtain the benefits of basis hedging, remember, basis hedging is fine-tuning your futures hedging, making adjustments because of things you might believe will come in the future, come to happen to the size of the basis based upon seasonal information that you've amassed. Okay, so basis hedging is fine-tuning hedging. But if you really get caught up and focus too much on the concept of basis hedging as opposed to just hedging the price risk, okay, with futures, if you focus on basis hedging too much, then you might cause yourself problems, because to obtain the benefits of basis hedging, hedgers have to time their hedges, and at certain times you may be or may need to be unhedged for some periods of time. So if you're going to be a serious basis hedger, then the added risk of being unhedged at certain times must be weighed against the benefits of this basis hedging. Okay? So one other thing that's interesting is that it may be possible to hedge basis variation itself. Often the spot asset price and a nearby month basis is highly correlated with the price differential, the spread, between a nearby and a more distant futures contract price. So the idea here is it may be possible to hedge basis variation itself if you've got a high correlation between the basis, which is just here, the cash price minus the futures price. Here I've indicated contract A. And if there's a correlation between that and a pair of more distant futures prices. Here I have futures price B and futures price C. So let's assume that we're going long the spot asset and we're hedging with a short position in the futures contract, and the delivery is delivery month A. And let's assume that there's another futures contract with delivery month B, and B is after A, and yet another futures contract with delivery month C, where C as a delivery month follows B. So you can see here in the picture that the basis risk that we face here might be able to be set off, or offset, excuse me, by taking a position here. So let's say we're long the spot asset, short this futures contract. We could go short a more distant futures contract and long an even more distant futures contract if the basis here has high correlation with this price differential. This is a futures spread. This is a futures spread right here. And what I've tried to show you here is that it may be possible to hedge basis variation itself with a futures spread. And when this high correlation exists between spreads and when this high correlation exists between the basis and more distant spreads between futures, a spread position can offset the basis risk in a hedge. And that's enough for this video. Thanks for watching.